When I'm rich, I'll marry you." A starving black boy whispered those words to a 9-year-old white girl who shared her only lunch with him every day for 6 months. Then he vanished. She thought he died. He thought she forgot. 22 years later, they stood face to face again. Stephen Mitchell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his corner office, 43 stories above downtown Atlanta. The city sprawled beneath him like a circuit board of lights and shadows, millions of lives moving through streets he had once slept on. At 31, he had built an empire from nothing, a real estate development corporation and a charitable foundation that bore his name in gold letters on buildings across the South. Magazine covers called him a visionary. Business journals ranked him among the most influential black entrepreneurs of his generation. None of it touched the hollow space inside his chest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet-worn leather that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But the thing he sought wasn't money. Tucked behind his driver's license, folded into a small square, was half a red ribbon. The color had faded over more than 2 decades, the fabric soft and fragile from being touched too many times. He didn't need to unfold it to remember what it meant. A little girl with blonde hair and serious eyes, a chain-link fence separating her world from his, the taste of a peanut butter sandwich, his first real meal in 3 days. Stephen closed his eyes and let the memory wash over him the way he did every night before he could sleep. She had been 9 years old, same as him. She never asked his name, never told anyone what she was doing. She just appeared at that fence every day during her lunch break, pushed her food through the gap, and sat with him while he ate. Sometimes she talked about school, about her parents fighting, about wanting a dog. Sometimes she just sat in silence, her presence enough to make him feel human. 6 months. 180 days of small kindnesses that no one else would give him. And then one morning, the social workers came. They found him sleeping under the overpass and loaded him into a van headed for a group home 3 states away. He had run to the school fence one last time, desperate to see her, to say goodbye. She was there as if she knew. The red ribbon in her hair caught the morning light like a small flame. He had reached through the fence and untied it with trembling fingers. She let him. He tore it in half, gave her one piece, kept the other. "When I'm rich," he had said, his voice cracking, "I'll marry you." She had smiled and her eyes were wet. "Promise. Promise." He had searched for her through private investigators, social media, alumni databases. He knew she had attended Jefferson Elementary in a small Georgia town. He knew her hair was blonde and her eyes were gray-blue. He knew the exact pattern of freckles across her nose, but he never learned her name. The investigators found dozens of potential matches, and he had quietly tracked each one to dead ends. Some had moved away, some had married and changed their names. Some simply didn't match the face burned into his memory. But he never stopped looking. The ribbon in his wallet was proof of a debt he could never repay, and a promise he intended to keep. His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Mitchell, your car is ready. The community meeting starts in an hour." Stephen tucked the ribbon away and straightened his tie. Tonight's meeting was in Riverside Heights, a low-income neighborhood on Atlanta's west side where his foundation had quietly funded after-school programs and housing assistance for years. The residents didn't know he was behind it. He preferred anonymity, letting the money do its work without his face attached. But recently his company had proposed a new affordable housing development in the area, and the community demanded to meet the man making decisions about their future. He had agreed for reasons he told no one. Riverside Heights was the last location on his list, the final place his investigators suggested the girl might have ended up. A long shot, they said. Probably nothing. But Stephen had built his fortune on long shots. He wasn't about to stop now. The community center was a converted warehouse with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry insects and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. By the time Stephen arrived, nearly 100 residents had gathered, elderly couples, young mothers with children on their laps. Teenagers slouched against the walls with skeptical expressions. The air smelled of coffee and distrust. Stephen took his place at the front table beside his project manager and two lawyers. He had done this before, faced crowds that viewed him with suspicion simply because he had money and they didn't. He understood their wariness. He had been them once, invisible and voiceless, watching powerful people make decisions that crushed lives without a second thought. The meeting opened with formalities, introductions, project overviews, timelines. Stephen let his team handle most of it while he scanned the room, searching faces the way he always did, looking for gray-blue eyes, looking for recognition that never came. Then a woman stood up in the third row and his breath caught. She was white, early 30s, with hair the color of wheat pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her clothes were simple jeans, a cardigan, flat shoes meant for walking long distances. But it was her posture that stopped him. Shoulders squared, chin lifted, the stance of someone who had spent her life fighting battles others didn't see. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, and her voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had prepared for this moment. "Your foundation has done good work here. I won't deny that. But this housing project isn't charity. It's development. And development has a way of promising community benefit while delivering community displacement." The room murmured in agreement. Stephen leaned forward, studying her face. Something about the set of her jaw, the way her eyebrows drew together when she was thinking it, triggered a recognition so deep it felt physical. But he couldn't be sure. Over 2 decades changed people, changed everything. "What's your name?" he asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Rachel Hayes. I'm a social worker here in Riverside Heights." Rachel. The name didn't ring any bells, but names could change. Faces less so. Hayes," Stephen said carefully. "What would it take to earn your trust?" She almost laughed. "You think trust can be earned in one meeting? The people in this room have watched investors come and go for decades. They promise jobs, affordable units, community spaces. Then the buildings go up, the rents increase, and the same families who were supposed to benefit end up pushed out to somewhere worse." She shook her head. "You want our trust. Don't ask for it. Prove you deserve it." The meeting continued for another hour, but Stephen barely heard the questions. His eyes kept drifting back to Rachel, the way she leaned in when someone else spoke, the gentle hand she placed on an elderly woman's shoulder, the fierce protectiveness in her expression whenever children were mentioned. She was devoted to this community in a way that went beyond professional obligation. This was personal for her. He could see it. When the meeting ended, the crowd dispersed slowly, clusters of neighbors lingering to talk. Stephen excused himself from his team and stepped outside, needing air, needing space to think. The evening had cooled, and the streetlights cast orange circles on cracked pavement. That's when he saw them. Rachel sat on the front steps of the community center, her arm around a small boy who couldn't have been older than 10. The child was crying silent, shaking sobs that spoke of a grief too heavy for his small body. Rachel held him close, murmuring words. Stephen couldn't hear her hand stroking his back in slow, patient circles. The boy was black thin, with the hollow cheeks of a child who had missed too many meals. His eyes, when he lifted them, held the same emptiness Stephen remembered seeing in his own reflection at that age. The look of someone who had already learned that the world didn't want them. And then Stephen saw it. On Rachel's wrist, half hidden beneath the sleeve of her cardigan, a faded red ribbon was tied around her watch band. The fabric was old, frayed at the edges, its color muted by time. But he knew that ribbon. He knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat. His hand moved to his pocket without thinking, fingers finding the matching piece. More than half his life he had carried it. All those years he had searched for the other half. It was her. The little girl who fed a starving stranger, the child who saw him when everyone else looked through him. She was sitting 10 feet away holding another broken boy, and she had no idea who he was. Stephen stood frozen, caught between the urge to run to her and the fear of what would happen if he did. If he told her the truth, now would she see him? really see him, or would she only see the CEO, the billionaire, the man in the expensive suit? Would his confession feel like a gift or a burden? He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. In his fantasies, the recognition was instant and mutual, a collision of two people who had never stopped looking for each other. But reality was messier. She didn't know him. To her, he was just another powerful man making promises about a community he could walk away from any time. The boy in her arms pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve. Rachel reached into her bag and handed him a tissue, her movements tender and unhurried. She said something that made him almost smile, and the sight of it cracked something open in Stephen's chest. She was still the same person. After all these years, after whatever life had done to her, she was still the girl who gave her lunch to a stranger, still the one who stayed when everyone else left. Stephen made a decision. He wouldn't tell her tonight. He would prove himself first, not as the boy she once saved, but as the man he had become. He would work beside her, earn her respect, show her that his commitment to this community wasn't about guilt or obligation. And when the time was right, when she knew him as Stephen and not just a name on a building, he would show her the ribbon. He stepped back into the shadows before she could notice him watching. Tomorrow he would return to Riverside Heights, not as a CEO making appearances, but as a man with something to prove. The promise he made at that fence all those years ago wasn't about money. It was about becoming someone worthy of the girl who saved his life. He wasn't there yet. But for the first time since he started searching, he knew exactly where to go. 3 weeks after this community meeting, Stephen returned to Riverside Heights. Not in his usual black sedan with tinted windows, but in a rental car he parked 2 blocks away. He wore jeans, a plain gray shirt, and work boots he had bought specifically for this occasion. No designer labels, no visible wealth, just a man showing up. Rachel was skeptical when he appeared at the community center that first morning asking to volunteer. "You want to help serve breakfast?" She looked him up and down as if searching for hidden cameras. "Don't you have board meetings? Acquisitions? Whatever it is, CEOs do." "I have capable people who can handle the business," Stephen replied. "What I don't have is a reason to get out of bed that means something." She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her jaw tightened, the slight narrowing of her eyes. But she was understaffed and overworked, and an extra pair of hands was an extra pair of hands. "Fine," she said. "Breakfast starts at 6:30. Don't be late." He wasn't late. Not that day, not any day that followed. The community center ran a morning meal program for neighborhood children whose families couldn't afford breakfast. Stephen learned to scramble eggs in industrial quantities, to pour juice without spilling, to wipe down tables and sweep floors and do the 100 small tasks that kept a place like this functioning. The work was nothing like his usual days, no negotiations, no power dynamics, no million-dollar decisions. Just eggs and orange juice and the sound of children's voices filling a room that smelled like pancakes. Noah was there every morning. The boy Rachel had been comforting on the steps that first night. Stephen learned his story in fragments over the following weeks, orphaned at 7 when his mother overdosed, bounced between foster homes that treated him more like furniture than family, currently living in temporary housing that was about to lose its funding. He was 10 years old and had already learned to expect nothing from anyone. Stephen recognized that look. He had worn it himself for years. Noah didn't talk much, but he watched everything. He watched how Stephen stacked the chairs, how he spoke to the other volunteers, how he treated the children who came through the line. Testing him, Stephen realized, waiting for the moment when the rich man would reveal his true colors and disappear. One morning, about a month into his volunteering, Stephen found Noah sitting alone in the corner of the center, staring at a book he clearly couldn't read. The words were too advanced, the text too dense. But the boy held on to it anyway, as if the act of holding a book made him someone worth noticing. Stephen pulled up a chair beside him. "What are you reading?" Noah shrugged, not meeting his eyes. "Just a book." "Can I see?" The boy hesitated, then handed it over. It was a worn copy of a biography about Frederick Douglass, clearly donated from someone's old collection. The pages were yellowed, the spine cracked. "This is a good one," Stephen said. "Hard, though. The language is old-fashioned." Noah's shoulders tightened defensively. "I can read it." Stephen didn't challenge the obvious lie. Instead, he opened to the first page and began reading aloud, his voice low enough that only Noah could hear. He read about Douglass's childhood, his early years in slavery, his hunger for knowledge in a world that tried to keep him ignorant. After a few pages, he stopped and handed the book back. "Tomorrow, same time, we can read more, if you want." Noah looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. From that day forward, they read together every morning before breakfast service began. Frederick Douglass, then other book stories of black men and women who had risen from nothing, who had refused to let the world define their limits. Noah's reading improved steadily, but more than that, something in him began to soften. The walls he had built around himself developed small cracks, letting in light. Rachel noticed. She noticed how Stephen arrived early and stayed late, how he learned the names of every child who came through the center, their birthdays, their favorite foods, the things that made them laugh, how he never talked down to anyone, never flashed his wealth or his status, never acted like his presence was a gift they should be grateful for. She noticed how Noah, who hadn't trusted an adult in years, began to seek Stephen out. How the boy's grades improved, how his silences became less hostile and more contemplative, how he started to believe, maybe for the first time, that he might matter to someone. One afternoon, after the center had closed for the day, Rachel found Stephen stacking chairs in the main room. Most volunteers left the moment their shift ended, eager to return to their real lives. But he was still there doing work no one had asked him to do. "Why are you really here?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. "And don't give me the corporate line about community investment." Stephen set down the chair he was holding and turned to face her. "Would you believe me if I said I grew up like these kids?" Rachel's expression flickered surprise, then skepticism. "You're a billionaire." "Now, not always." He met her gaze steadily. "I know what it feels like to be invisible, to be so hungry you can't think straight, to believe that no one in the world cares whether you live or die." She was quiet for a moment, studying him with those gray-blue eyes that had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades. "What changed?" Stephen felt the ribbon in his pocket pressing against his thigh like a heartbeat. This was the moment he could tell her. One sentence and the secret would be out. But something held him back. Fear, maybe. Or the knowledge that once he spoke those words, everything between them would shift. She would look at him differently as the boy she saved, not the man standing before her. And he needed her to know him as he was now before she learned who he had been. "Someone showed me kindness," he said finally, "when I didn't deserve it, when I couldn't repay it. It changed everything." Rachel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She didn't ask for details, and he was grateful. Some truths needed time to surface. "Well," she said, "keep stacking chairs. I'm not letting you off easy just because you had a hard childhood." He laughed, and the sound surprised them both. The weeks that followed created a rhythm between them. They worked side by side at the center, debating approaches to community development, arguing about the best ways to help children like Noah without creating dependency. Rachel challenged every assumption Stephen held about philanthropy, about power, about the relationship between money and meaningful change. "You think building things solves problems," she said one evening as they walked through the neighborhood after a particularly long day. "A new community center, a housing development, structures." "Structures provide stability," Stephen countered. "You can't help people who don't have a safe place to sleep." "Structures can also become monuments to the people who built them, not the people who use them." Rachel shook her head. "I've watched organizations pour millions into buildings that sit half-empty because no one asked the community what they actually needed. The help that matters isn't about buildings. It's about showing up, day after day, being present even when it's inconvenient. Stephen thought about the center about Noah, about the mornings spent reading books and scrambling eggs. She was right, he realized. The money he had given over the years, the anonymous donations and funded programs, none of it compared to these past weeks of simply being there. "You sound like someone who learned that lesson the hard way," he said. Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Maybe I did." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, but the shadows in her eyes told him there was more to her story wounds she carried that went deeper than professional frustration. One night after a community event that ran late, Stephen sat alone on the front steps of the center. The neighborhood was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional passing car. He pulled out his wallet and removed the ribbon, unfolding it carefully in the dim light. He didn't hear Rachel approach until she was already there, standing a few feet away with her keys in her hand. "What's that?" Stephen's heart stopped. He looked up to find her staring at the faded red fabric in his palm, her face pale in the streetlight. Her eyes moved from the ribbon to his face and back again, and he watched as recognition began to dawn. "Where did you get that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Stephen stood slowly, the ribbon still visible in his open hand. There was no hiding now. No more time to earn his place before the truth emerged. The moment had arrived, whether he was ready or not. "You gave it to me," he said quietly. "All those years ago, at the fence behind Jefferson Elementary." Rachel's hand flew to her wrist, to the faded ribbon tied around her watch band. The ribbon she had worn since she was 9 years old, the one she couldn't bring herself to throw away no matter how many times she tried. "That boy." Her voice cracked. "You're that boy. I'm that boy." She took a step back, her breathing uneven. Stephen didn't move, didn't try to close the distance between them. He understood. This was the moment she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. "I thought you were dead." The words came out broken, jagged. "When you disappeared, I went to the fence every day for months. You never came back. I asked everyone, teachers, police, anyone who would listen. Nobody knew anything. Nobody cared." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I was 9 years old and I thought I let you die." The weight of her confession hit Stephen like a physical blow. All those years he had imagined her moving on, forgetting about the hungry boy at the fence, living a life unburdened by their brief intersection. He never considered that she had carried guilt, just as he had carried longing. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt hopelessly inadequate. "I didn't know how to find you. I didn't even know your name." "Rachel." She laughed bitterly through her tears. "My name is Rachel. I've been right here the whole time." "I know." He took a careful step toward her. "I've been looking for you for more than half my life." She shook her head, backing away. "This doesn't make sense. You're a CEO, a billionaire. You could have found anyone." "I tried. I hired investigators, searched records, followed every lead. But you moved, and your name wasn't in the school files, and I only had a face and a ribbon and a memory." Rachel wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Why did you keep looking?" Stephen held up the ribbon, its faded red catching the faint light. "Because you were the first person who ever saw me. Not the homeless kid people stepped over. Not the problem someone else had to deal with. Me. You saw me as a human being and it changed everything. I just gave you my lunch." Her voice was small, defensive. "Any decent person would have done the same." "No." Stephen's tone was firm. "They wouldn't have. I spent years on the street in group homes in places where I was invisible at best and a burden at worst. No one else ever stopped. Just you." Rachel was silent for a long moment, tears still streaming down her face. Then she asked the question he had been dreading. "So all of this, the foundation, the volunteering, the housing project, was it about finding me? Was I just a mission?" "No." Stephen stepped closer, his voice urgent. I started the foundation because I wanted to break the cycle, because I didn't want any other kid to feel as invisible as I did. I came to Riverside Heights because my investigators said you might be here, yes, but I stayed because of what I found. The community, the children. Noah. He held her gaze. You. Not the memory of you. The woman standing in front of me right now. Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know what to do with this. I spent over 2 decades convincing myself that I failed you, that I should have done more, told more people, forced someone to help. That guilt is part of who I am. It's why I do this work. Then let me tell you something. Stephen closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just a foot away. You didn't fail me. You saved me. And not just because of the food. Because you showed me that kindness exists. That somewhere in this world there are people who will sit with you in your hunger and not ask for anything in return. Rachel looked at the ribbon in his hand, then at the matching piece on her own wrist. 2 halves of the same thread separated for more than 2 decades. I can't be what you've built me up to be in your head, she said quietly. I'm not the angel from your childhood. I'm just a woman who spent her whole life trying to make up for something she thought she did wrong. I'm not looking for an angel. Stephen's voice was gentle. I'm looking for you. Looking for whoever you are now. She turned away, hugging herself tighter. I need time. This is too much. Stephen nodded, even though she couldn't see it. I understand. He watched her walk to her car, watched her sit behind the wheel for several minutes without starting the engine. When she finally drove away, the night felt emptier than before. But he had told her the truth. Whatever came next, at least there were no more secrets between them. The following days were difficult. Rachel kept her distance, professional but cool, avoiding any conversation that might stray into personal territory. Stephen gave her space, continuing his work at the center, his mornings with Noah, his quiet presence in a community that had begun to feel like home. Then, on a Thursday evening, the crisis hit. Stephen was at his office downtown when his phone rang. Rachel's name on the screen made his heart lurch. He's gone. Her voice was raw with panic. Noah is gone. What do you mean, gone? He found out he's being transferred to a group home in another state. The funding for his temporary housing fell through and the state won't let him stay. He ran away. Rachel's breath caught. Stephen, I've looked everywhere. He's been gone for 5 hours. Stephen was already grabbing his keys. I'm on my way. There's something else. Rachel's voice dropped. The press found out about us. Someone at the meeting leaked the story. They're saying you're using the community for PR, that our relationship is a publicity stunt. She exhaled shakily. Your company's stock dropped. Your board is demanding you distance yourself from Riverside Heights. Stephen didn't hesitate. I don't care about the stock. I don't care about the board. I care about finding Noah. He drove through the night, searching streets he had once slept on, looking for a boy who reminded him too much of himself. The rain started around midnight, cold and relentless, and all Stephen could think about was Noah out there alone, hungry, believing that no one was coming for him. At 3 a.m, he found him. Noah was huddled in the doorway of an abandoned building, soaked to the bone, his arms wrapped around his knees. He looked up when Stephen approached, and his eyes held the same emptiness they had on that first night, the look of someone who had stopped expecting rescue. Stephen sat down beside him on the wet concrete. He didn't say anything at first, just reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded red ribbon. You see this? He asked quietly. Noah glanced at it, then looked away. It's just a piece of fabric. It's everything I have from when I was your age. Stephen held it up so the boy could see. A girl gave this to me when I was 10 years old. I was hungry, homeless, invisible. She was the only person who saw me as human. She gave me her lunch every day for 6 months, and when they took me away, I tore this ribbon from her hair because I needed proof that kindness existed. Noah was watching him now, his guard lowering slightly. I spent over 2 decades looking for her, Stephen continued. I built a company, made more money than I could ever spend, searched every database and hired every investigator I could find. You know why? The boy shook his head. Because that ribbon taught me something. It taught me that one person can change everything. One person who shows up, who sees you, who refuses to look away. Stephen met Noah's eyes. She's here now. Rachel. She's the one who saved me. And she's the one who's been fighting to save you. Noah's chin trembled. Nobody's coming for me. They never do. I came. Stephen's voice was steady. I'm here, and I'm not leaving. The boy stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, his walls crumbled. The tears came silently at first, then in shuddering sobs that shook his thin frame. Stephen put an arm around him, holding him the way no one had ever held him when he was small and afraid and alone. You're not invisible, Stephen said quietly. Not to me. Not to Rachel. Not anymore. When Rachel found them an hour later, the rain had stopped, and the first gray light of dawn was creeping across the sky. She ran to them, dropping to her knees beside Noah, pulling him into her arms with a fierceness that spoke of terror finally released. Stephen watched her hold the boy, watched her cry with relief, and understood something with perfect clarity. This was never about repaying a debt. It was about passing on what she had given him, the simple, world-changing act of being seen. So, the morning after they found Noah, Rachel sat in Stephen's car outside the community center watching the sun rise over Riverside Heights. Neither of them had slept. Noah was safe inside, wrapped in blankets on the old couch in the back office, finally resting after the longest night of his young life. Rachel stared at the faded ribbon still tied around her wrist. She had worn it for over 2 decades without fully understanding why. Now she knew. I spent my whole life trying to make up for losing you, she said quietly, not looking at Stephen. Every child I helped, every family I fought for, it was always about that boy at the fence, the one I couldn't save. Stephen turned to face her. You did save him. I gave him sandwiches. Rachel's voice broke. I gave him sandwiches and then he disappeared and I never knew if he lived or died. For more than half my life I carried that weight. And I carried this. Stephen held up his half of the ribbon, proof that someone in this world thought I was worth feeding, worth sitting with, worth remembering. He reached over and gently touched the ribbon on her wrist. You didn't fail me, Rachel. You shaped everything I became. She finally looked at him, her eyes red from exhaustion and tears. So what happens now? You go back to your board meetings and your billion-dollar deals, and I stay here trying to keep kids like Noah from falling through the cracks. No, Stephen's voice was firm. I told you I don't care about the stock price or what the board thinks. I meant it. They're going to push you out. The news is already calling this a scandal. Let them. Stephen leaned back in his seat, looking out at the neighborhood that had become more real to him than any boardroom. I built that company from nothing. I can build something else. Something that matters. Rachel shook her head slowly. You can't throw away everything you've worked for. Not for this community, not for me, I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally using it for what it was always meant for. He turned back to her. When I was 10 years old, starving and invisible, I made a promise. I said when I got rich, I'd marry you. But I understand now that the promise was never about money. It was about becoming someone worthy of what you gave me. Rachel was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't need you to be worthy. I don't need you to prove anything. I know. Stephen reached for her hand. That's why I want to. Not because I owe you. Because I choose you. The woman you are now, not the girl I remember. I'm not easy to love. Rachel's laugh was hollow. I fight too hard. I trust too little. I've spent so long protecting myself that I don't know how to let anyone in. Then we'll figure it out together. Stephen squeezed her hand. No rush, no pressure. Just two people who found each other after all these years of searching. The door of the community center opened, and Noah appeared on the steps, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. He looked small and tired, but something in his face had changed. The emptiness was still there, but now there was something else alongside it. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. Rachel got out of the car and walked toward him. How are you feeling? Noah shrugged, the gesture achingly familiar. Hungry. She smiled despite everything. Then let's get you some breakfast. The three of them went inside together, and for the first time the center felt less like a workplace and more like a home. Stephen made eggs while Rachel toasted bread, and Noah set the table with the careful precision of a child who wanted desperately to be useful. They ate in comfortable silence, the morning light streaming through the windows, and something settled into place between them. After breakfast, Rachel pulled Stephen aside. The state won't let Noah stay in temporary housing anymore, and with the funding gone, there's nowhere for him to go except that group home 3 states away. Stephen nodded slowly. What if there was another option? Rachel looked at him sharply. What do you mean? I mean, I have resources, connections. If we filed for emergency guardianship, if we could prove he has a stable placement here. Stephen? Rachel's voice was cautious. You can't adopt a child to make a point. I'm not making a point. Stephen glanced through the doorway at Noah, who was carefully washing dishes at the sink. I see myself in him. The way he watches everything, waiting for people to disappoint him. The way he's already learned not to want things because wanting hurts too much. He turned back to Rachel. I can't change what happened to me, but I can change what happens to him. Rachel was quiet for a long time. Then she said, It would have to be both of us. Joint guardianship. He needs stability, not a single person who might disappear. Stephen's heart stopped. Both of us. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Rachel met his eyes. That means commitment. Real commitment. Not just to Noah, but to each other. Are you saying what I think you're saying? Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out her half of the ribbon. She held it up next to his, the 2 faded pieces nearly touching. I'm saying that maybe a promise made by 2 9-year-olds at a fence isn't as childish as I thought. Her voice was steady now, certain. I'm saying that I spent over 2 decades carrying guilt for something that turned out to be the most important thing I ever did. And I'm saying that if you're willing to build a life with me, a real life, not a fairy tale, then I'm willing to try. Stephen took her half of the ribbon and placed it against his own. The edges aligned perfectly, the faded red forming a complete thread for the first time in over 2 decades. I choose you, he said, today, and every day after. Rachel smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her since that night on the steps when everything changed. Then I guess we have some paperwork to file. 6 months later, they stood in front of a new building on the edge of Riverside Heights. The sign above the door read, Mitchell Hayes Youth Center, in bold letters. Below it, in smaller script, because everyone deserves to be seen. The ribbon ceremony had drawn a crowd, community members, local officials, children from the breakfast program who had watched the building rise from an empty lot over the past months. Noah stood between Stephen and Rachel, wearing a new jacket and shoes that actually fit. On his wrist, tied in a careful knot, was the red ribbon hole again restored by a seamstress who had stitched the 2 halves together with thread the exact same shade. Rachel cut the ribbon with oversized scissors while the crowd applauded. Stephen caught her eye across the ceremony and she grinned at him. The same girl who had once pushed sandwiches through a fence, now a woman who had found her way back to the boy she saved. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed and the sun began to set, the 3 of them walked to the old fence behind what used to be Jefferson Elementary. The school had been torn down years ago, replaced by a community garden, but a section of the original fence remained preserved, someone said, because it was historic. Stephen stood where he had stood all those years ago, looking through the iron bars at the place where everything began. "I used to think this fence was a wall," he said quietly, "something keeping me out of a world I'd never belonged to." Rachel took his hand. "And now I think it was a bridge." He looked at Noah, who was tracing the patterns in the iron with his fingers. A place where two worlds touched just for a moment, just long enough to change everything. Noah looked up at both of them, his expression serious in a way that made him seem older than his 10 years. "Do you think it matters? One person being nice to another person?"